Storage of documents is a major issue, particularly in a digital age, and this is of immediate concern to the foundations. Particular if you're considering that some of the big foundations have very large archives, which enables them to set an agenda, because as the access to the archives is relatively open, historians inspect files of these big foundations. As a consequence, they talk about these big foundations, and they tend to neglect the smaller foundations, which do not have the archives. We lack still information and data on tax returns. They have been rarely published with regard to German foundations, quite contrary to the American foundations. So we need more transparency, more reporting, and more regulatory procedures within the foundations, but also in the relationship between state and foundations. But in particular within the foundations, because we do not want the state to impose these regulatory procedures on the foundations. And the third challenge, and this is, I think, at the same time a trend as well, is to establish efficient management structures without allowing economic criteria, economic terms in particular, but also criteria of economic rationality to dominate the life of foundations.
Well, I think in America, one of the things that we've found is a language that talks more about grant making as an investment process rather than a gift process. That has lots of implications in terms of how you want to support institutions, how they grow, the kind of commitment of a foundation to the institution that it's giving the money to, that it has a sort of long-term commitment to that institution. And another is what we now call mission-related investing. For many years, people thought of the large corpus of an endowment as something that simply sat there and we took 5% a year from it for our grant making. Whereas now there's an idea of what do you do with that? If you have a $200 million endowment invested, maybe you should invest it in some way that actually works toward your mission. The third one, and it's very recent and it's an interesting development, because philanthropy has a long enough history now in the United States, there's now a real interest. Some foundations are beginning to show a real interest in that history and what can be learned from the history, and whether there are really distinct lessons that can be learned from successes and failures. And looking back on that history is something we're seeing, and some of the large foundations are beginning to kind of explore their past in order to help them with their strategic planning in the future.
As a former program director of an institution which had the task to promote science and research, I have three main points. The first is, it's like an advice, find a balance between grant making and operating activities. The second is be sustainable and forget strict 2 years, 3 years or 5 years funding periods. And my third point would be collaborate, national and international.
In the next 5 years, I see three important trends emerging. The first of these is a continued formation of foundations in Germany. In addition to that, I expect that interest rates will remain low. And so if you have low interest rates, of course, the endowment funds from foundations won't provide nearly as much as what charities generally will need. And so two things I think will result out of this. On the one hand, likely we will see an increase in the importance of fundraising. In addition, there may be some adaptation of American models. Recently, some foundations, in fact, the Herren Foundation in the United States, committed to making 100% of its investments either through grants or program-related investments. And what program-related investments are placing endowment money in for-profit firms that are related to what your mission is. Lastly is perhaps more of a wish, but it is something that I think is gradually moving in that direction. A trend for us to follow is an increase in transparency. And one does see some foundations beginning to report more. The Stiftung Mercator is leading the way in this regard. But generally speaking, as a field, we don't have a good sense in the public of what each foundation is doing. My hope is that we get an increased transparency in the next 5 years, first in order to make foundations better able to make grants, but secondly, for those of us who are studying the field, to get a sense of really the entire mass of the field and where grants are going.
So speaking about the United States, the first thing I would say is the enormous diversity of American foundations. So if you put that as a trend, it's that there's many trends or many disparate things going on among different groups and different kinds of foundations. All foundations are looking to maximize their influence or their effectiveness by seeking leverage of some kind. And there are, again, an enormous variety of efforts to find leverage. There are many different areas in which people are trying to use foundations. There's a lot of effort on school reform right now. You can't say there's one kind of response to elementary and secondary school reform by foundations, but there's an enormous range. One thing people are talking a great deal about is maximizing the impact of foundations. If a foundation has limited resources, maybe what it should try to do is invest its money proactively in socially proactive activities.